When it was created, the political philosophy known as federalism was born out of necessity to find a common ground. Since then, it has continued to evolve, also out of necessity. The basic concept of federalism is a government that consists of multiple layers, such as national and state governments. It splits the final authority of the government between the national and state layers. Dual federalism, which is also called layer cake federalism, considers different layers of government, such as state, county, and municipal governments, as separate entities bound together by the federal government. Much like layers of a cake are bound together by the icing. Dual federalism slowly evolved in the U.S. until the mid-20th century, until the stock market crash of 1929. Following Black Tuesday, the resulting economic crisis developed into the Great Depression. In an effort to boost the nation's economy out of the Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt urged, pushed, and molded the federal government to grow so that it could implement aid programs known as New Deal legislation.
I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people.
With the New Deal legislation, the recipe for the layer cake form of federalism evolved into one more resembling a marble cake. In this system, known as cooperative federalism, the governmental layers share many responsibilities and policies rather than keeping them separate. Thus, cooperative federalism allows national and state governments to share the costs of programs and administrative roles while implementing federal policies. As the federal government grew with the New Deal, the move from dual federalism to cooperative federalism continued. One of the most notable evolutions sprang from the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment. Through judicial interpretation, these clauses shifted the precedent of power toward national supervision of the states.
Some scholars believe that the separation of powers between the federal and state governments is futile. They maintain that while in theory both the federal and state governments are granted separate powers, when the theory is put into practice, the federal government most often prevails. Others maintain that the separation of powers as outlined by the Constitution is valid and useful. They maintain that the separation of powers is not futile, but necessary to limit the power of the federal government over the people of the nation. Some people say that the separation of federal and state government powers is futile. Do you agree with this statement? What if you knew that the Supreme Court supported the federal government's use of implied powers to overrule states' decisions? In McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court addressed whether Congress had the authority to create a national bank in Maryland. When Maryland charged the bank a hefty tax, the head cashier, James McCulloch, refused to pay, and the matter was brought to court. The court ruled that establishing a national bank was a necessary and proper function of the federal government. This decision gave Congress implied powers, giving the federal government supremacy over state governments. Knowing that the federal government's implied powers give states less power, do you believe the separation of powers is futile? What if you knew that the separation of powers has also been challenged in times of war? One of the main reasons the Civil War occurred was the South's position that states had the right to nullify a federal law if it is deemed unconstitutional by the states. John C. Calhoun contended that the right to use slaves should be determined by the states and should not be banned by the federal government. The outcome of the Civil War discounted these claims, and the ban on slavery was upheld. The result was that states could not declare congressional decisions unconstitutional. Understanding that states cannot deem a federal law unconstitutional, do you think this violates the separation of powers between federal and state governments, causing it to be futile? What if you knew that the federal government provides the legal interpretations that define the boundaries between federal and state governments? The regulation of interstate commerce is a federal power. However, interstate commerce was not clearly defined until Gibbons versus Ogden. In 1824, the Supreme Court broadly interpreted the Constitution's Commerce Clause, giving Congress the power to control almost every aspect of interstate commerce. Knowing that the Supreme Court can bolster congressional powers through loose interpretation of the Constitution, do you believe the separation of powers is futile? While some people believe that the separation of powers is a valid attempt to manage the balance between the federal and state government, and while the Supreme Court has upheld this important balance, others believe that the separation of powers is futile. Regardless of arguments for or against the separation of powers, it is an important part of our federalist democratic nation.
Cooperative federalism has since evolved into fiscal federalism. In this system, the national government provides grants and funding to states. This concept was originally created during the Confederation period to help fund farm-related education. Since then, grants in aid have grown to encompass public housing, urban development, and even school lunch programs. When a state needs to implement a new program or project, it often seeks assistance from the federal government, knowing that any federal money also comes with federal regulations. Any state wanting to receive money for highways, for example, must also submit to federally regulated speed limits. No state is required to request or receive any government funding. However, trying to fund multiple statewide programs can be economically difficult without federal assistance. Also, refusing federal regulations can make things more difficult for a state. For example, if a state refused to implement federally mandated speed limits, the federal government could cut funding for highways. This could domino in a devastating way. The cut in funding could cause highways to deteriorate. A poor highway system could keep large corporations from locating to that state. This could obviously hurt the state's economy. This is why states typically accept regulations in order to provide the funding for necessary programs and projects. Grants come in several forms, each of which is regulated differently. One is categorical grants, which provide funding for specific projects, such as roads and schools, and are heavily regulated. Formula grants provide money according to a defined set of rules, such as providing more urban development for states with higher urban populations. Project grants are designed to create competition for economic opportunity between states. Project grants such as water projects, government facilities, and research grants are not regulated as heavily as categorical or formula grants. A fourth type is a block grant, a very desirable general-purpose grant that has even fewer restrictions than project grants. The regulations states must follow to receive any federal assistance are called conditions of aid and are often difficult to meet. One major condition of aid states face is funding. Often, Congress passes legislation without any national funding to support it, forcing the states to pay for these mandates. One such unfunded mandate was the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001.
One of the inherent principles of the No Child Left Behind Act is that we believe every child can learn, and we want to continue to raise the bar, continue to raise expectations, so that every child does learn. George W. Bush, 2003.
Even though state officials recognize the Act's importance, increasing the cost of education without gaining any federal funding makes it extremely difficult to implement. Because of this, several states have considered ending all federal money for education and rejecting the No Child Left Behind Act. States slowly gained back power over pieces of congressional legislation through devolution, the concept of scaling back the size and activities of the national government and giving more control over domestic programs to the states. This process can extend to local governments and even non-profit organizations or private groups through second and third order devolution.